Nintendo actually got into the trend of fighting games quite early. Unfortunately, even the folks at Nintendo Power hated it. Next up is the 1986 action series brawler, Urban Champion. Like many of the other black box games, the origins of Urban Champion can be traced back to an earlier project of Nintendo's. Instead of making the transition from toy to video game, like Mach Rider, or arcade cabinet to video game, like Wild Gunman, Urban Champion was an evolution of boxing, one of the Game & Watch games. To quickly recap, there were a few vehicles that Nintendo released products through before the launch of the NES in America. The company had produced several arcade cabinets since the hit game Donkey Kong in 1981, including Popeye, Mario Bros., and Donkey Kong Jr. They also produced games for the Versus system, an arcade system with interchangeable chips which allowed for multiple games to be played on a single cabinet, not unlike the technology used in the Famicom or NES. The Game & Watch line was another one of their major products. These small handheld devices functioned as rudimentary phone games before cell phones existed. They had built-in clock and alarm functions, and would feature a simple, usually high-score based game to accompany it. They were quite popular with people commuting to work that needed something to do on public transit, both in Japan and America. They were so popular, in fact, that there are a whopping 60 different Game & Watch variations that were made between 1980 and 1991. One of these games was boxing, also known as Punch-Out in the United States. This was the first of a few Game & Watches that were intended for multiplayer action, but it could be played solo. It would also be the very first fighting game that Nintendo ever put out, and one of the earliest true fighting games ever to be made. As we've seen a multitude of times, Nintendo repurposed many of their past projects into black box games, making a few adjustments to help them work on a home console. That cannot be said about Urban Champion. The game is almost exactly the same as Boxing, a title that came out on a system with a fraction of the capability of the NES. This disappointing truth is one of the main reasons why the game was such a critical failure. Urban Champion was Nintendo's first attempt at the fighting game genre. The gameplay could not be any more simple. Two players start on opposite ends of a city corner, duking it out until one player gets pushed off the screen. There are only a few moves available: strong punches, weak punches, and blocks, all of which can be positioned high or low. Players have 200 stamina each, and there is a 99-second time limit per screen. There are up to 5 rounds per game. In order to win, one must prevail over their opponent 3 times. Unlike the Game & Watch version it's based upon, Urban Champion is situated on what seems to be an urban block in New York. There are a few elements outside the fighting that play into this theme and help to spice up the game just a bit. A woman can appear in a window, dropping flower pots on the players. If they're hit, they lose some HP and get knocked into a daze, allowing their opponent to land a nasty blow. Every so often, a cop car will drive by, forcing the players all the way to the respective sides of the screen, pretending like nothing was happening. This essentially resets any progress that's occurred in a fight, forcing the players back to square one. These are also some of the earliest examples of stage hazards in fighting games. While other fighting titles like 1984's arcade hit Karate Champ certainly had much better combat mechanics, nearly all aspects of the game revolved around pure skill. In typical Nintendo fashion, Urban Champion's inclusion of luck-based events evened the playing field to a certain extent. Depending on one's view of fighting games, this could be seen as a frustrating choice. However, it is undeniable that the addition of hazards set the stage, so to speak, for more casual fighting games to follow. This isn't the only design feature that would see further growth as the fighting game genre developed. While stamina did exist, the game functioned more akin to a sumo-styled fighter. There was a 99-second time limit, yet 200 hit points of stamina per player, meaning that it would be highly unlikely for games to conclude via fainting. Naturally, knocking your opponent out of the ring was the best way to win. This style split the genre into 2 halves: fighting games that focused on stamina depletion, and fighting games that centered on pushing the opponent out of bounds. Urban Champion was the first game to experiment with the latter. By placing the emphasis on territory control in addition to stamina management, players had to focus on multiple factors when considering what move to use. Right? Well, Urban Champion didn't actually encourage this at all. Instead, it rewards players who run up to their opponent and endlessly mash the weak high punch, hoping their opponent misses a block and allowing them to continuously chain this to the other side of the screen. In reality, stage hazards hardly even play a minor role in standard gameplay. Most matches don't last long enough for the woman to drop her flower pots, and the cops hardly show up anyways. Urban Champion brings many incredibly unique design choices to the table, but in the end, it hardly utilizes any of them. It's consistently received poor reviews that mention its overly simplistic gameplay and tedious nature. While it's true that Urban Champion itself made poor use of its many innovations, it would be cruel to ignore its potential impacts. One notable game franchise has consistently implemented sumo-style fighting mechanics and stage hazards. Now, I cannot in any way assert that the connection between Super Smash Bros., one of Nintendo and HAL's most beloved franchises, and Urban Champion, a pitiful attempt at the fighting genre, is rock solid, but there is certainly some overlap between the two games. I can't find an instance of another sumo-based fighting game from after Urban Champion, but before Super Smash Bros. For the N64. I'm sure there exists an obscure title from this era that made use of this style, but it would seem that neither had much of an impact on Masahiro Sakurai, the creator of the Super Smash Bros. Franchise. He has stated in multiple interviews that his inspiration lay with the traditional Japanese game of ohajiki, in which players flick marbles at their opponent's marbles to knock them out of the play area. I find it unlikely that neither of these key figures knew of Urban Champion's existence, but I can't find any interviews in which the game is mentioned to have any impact on the development of Smash Bros. The fighting game genre would go on to prove massively popular. Kung Fu's creator, Takashi Nishiyama, went on to repurpose the mechanics of the original game into Street Fighter, a game that did everything Urban Champion did, but way, way better. One more fighting game of Nintendo's creation would come out on the Famicom, Joy Mech Fight. Though this title never saw an American release, it would be Nintendo's first attempt at a fighting game since Urban Champion, and it was pretty influential in its own right. It would seem that Nintendo has a real soft spot for Urban Champion. It's been re-released more times than almost any other black box game. It got its own e-reader card pack and a Wii, Wii U, and 3DS Virtual Console port. Unfortunately, it would seem that familiarity breeds contempt. Game journalists were complaining about the small cameo it held in Tetris DS. They certainly wouldn't appreciate it coming back 4 separate times. Overall, Urban Champion was a mediocre, yet somewhat influential fighting game. It provides an amount of fun between feuding friends, but it was nowhere near polished enough to become an all-time classic. The only thing Urban Champion won was a place in many's worst of NES lists.